Rose water, rosehip tea, essential oils. These are all hot items on the herbal market right now, and they all have to do with the medicinal use of roses. Hi, I'm Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and what I want to go through today is the question of, are these safe? What are they supposed to do? And most specifically, the question that gets asked me a lot is, which roses should I use this for? So that's what I want to go through now, is to talk about which roses are good for petals, which roses are good for hips, which roses you should grow in your garden for herbal use. Let's talk a minute about safety. That's an important part of the conversation. Humans have been using roses in culinary and herbal purposes for centuries, if not millennia. We have a pretty good idea of what we can get away with here, and it's a fairly safe record overall. The fresh parts of roses are not toxic to mammals, otherwise rabbits and deers would be in trouble, wouldn't they? The thing you have to be far more concerned about the fresh parts of roses is the spray residue. So if you have not grown it yourself, I would be suspicious. That's why I'm talking about growing your own roses for herbal use, is that if you get a bouquet of roses from the store, clearly those, you have to presume, have been sprayed by the producer. So if it doesn't come from your own garden or wild collected from an area you're pretty confident hasn't been sprayed for weeds, then I wouldn't use it herbally. Second thing I'm going to say about this is that the more concentrated or extracted the parts of the roses, the higher concentration of the phytochemicals. So just as it would be safe to pluck a flower off a rose and eat it, if you took 3,000 kilograms of that and distilled it into an oil that's only 1 kilogram, like they do when they're preparing essential oils of roses, you know those phytochemicals are there in much, much higher concentration. Same goes for rosehip oils or other powders and extracts of roses. In those cases, if you're using it for those strong extracts and herbals, I would definitely be consulting with a qualified herbalist or your doctor even, because they can have stronger effects in those concentrations. So the first rose I should definitely talk about is Rosa gallica officinalis, the apothecary's rose. And even that epithet officinalis actually means the official rose that's to be used medicinally. So all the old references from Europe will be talking about this rose. This rose is one of the ancient roses. It was held by the monks during the Dark Ages in the monasteries. At least that's the full history of it. And when it came out to the public, they loved it. So they used it for everything. And love potion was one of its traditional thoughts. Also, an anti-aging potion, or kind of a potion of youth, is another one that they talked about. But they were prescribed by apothecaries for all sorts of maladies, including any kind of a fever, cough, indigestion, all sorts of general tonics for the body. That's the one that they're talking about here. The way it was applied was either as the roses infused in an oil, or the rose oil infused in a different carrier oil, or the petals were dried and then ground into a powder and then applied that way. In Chinese medicine, the same rose is mentioned as a cure for menstrual cramps. And in any case, if you're talking about the real medicinal rose, this is the one that's usually referenced. Now I want to go into some of the specific uses of the different parts of the rose plant in the modern herbal, because that's a little different than the traditional old school recipes cooked up by apothecaries. So in the modern herbal, they really talk about its effects being more so in mood improvement, antidepressant, the antibacterial, antiseptic properties, anti-inflammatory, and maybe a little bit analgesic, meaning it reduces pain. All of these claims are supported by science to some degree, in that they've done small limited trials, and they've found some support for these claims. They know the chemicals are there, but they haven't been widely trialed on humans, except for the fact that there's tons and tons of anecdotal evidence that came from centuries of use. So your mileage may vary. Now, it's relatively safe to harvest your own petals. Usually when they talk about harvesting petals, they're talking about taking off the petals and then snipping off that little white bit at the base of the petal. That tends to be far more bitter than the rest of the petal. Overall, the flavor is fragrant and floral, but also a little bit astringent. It makes you pucker up a little bit. So that's how you would expect to use it. You can use it fresh in a tea. You can dry them in a tea. They're obviously used in culinary quite a lot. There's lots of recipes from the Middle East that use rose petals either with or without rose water. So I think it's generally considered to be safe to use, and some people throw them into the bathtub as well. I think that's probably just more for for mood. So let's talk about the roses that you would use for that. And certainly if you have the apothecary's rose, fantastic, but more often these days they're talking about any modern red rose with a good fragrance on it. And some of the ones that I saw in an old herbal were some of the hybrid teas, things like General Jacqueminot or Eugène Fürst is another one that I saw listed on there. But I wouldn't hesitate to use the modern roses, things like Mr. Lincoln, which has bright red and a knockout scent. Also Don Juan, the climber, also has a strong scent and good dark petals. I think they talk about the darker the rose, the darker red the rose, the more they trust the sort of properties of it, or at least that's what I've seen substituted into recipes over the apothecary's rose. But ultimately anything with a really good scent is likely to have a decent flavor as well as just make you feel good in using it. Up to this point, I've been talking a little bit more about the petals. Let's talk a bit about the hips now. The traditional rose hip that's used is the dog rose. That's the Rosa canina, or its close cousin, the eglantine rose, or the sweet briar rose, Rosa eglanteria. I'll put up pictures of those right now. That said, any kind of a rose hip has similar properties here. I would be using the fleshy ones if you're trying to use it for a jam or a jelly or a preserve or for the fresh pulp. And nothing in that case compares to Rosa rugosa, which just has big, juicy hips that are really strongly flavored, have lots of vitamin C in them. So that's the one I would recommend for that use. But again, any wild rose, as long as the hips aren't too tiny and you won't get much off of them. Now, as for their fresh or dried use, again, rose hips have high vitamin C, so that's one of the things, but they're usually recommended for along the same reasons as the petals. So an anti-inflammatory, anti-arthritic, they say often, and if you're using it as a rose hip tea that you're preparing, oftentimes they're talking about relieving cramps or reducing digestive problems, so for diarrhea and that kind of thing. While I'm talking about rose hips, I may as well put in a word or two about rosehip oil. It's not something that you would be producing at home. Rosehip oil is a large-scale production from a harvest. I hear it's in Chile, and they produce this oil, which is intended for external use, usually for skin conditioning and such. Because of its reputed, again, anti-inflammatory properties and antibacterial properties, it would be good for treating acne or swelling or redness. That's usually what it's used for. It's not usually recommended for internal use, that's what I hear, and also some people are allergic to rosehip oil, so be careful about that. And once again, it isn't something you would be using, creating yourself, but the rose that they do use for it is, again, that dog rose, the Rosa canina. Let's move on to talk about rose oil now, and again, this is probably not something you'll be extracting at home, but it is interesting to know which roses that they use for it. Typically in Bulgaria and the Middle East, they're using a rose called the damask rose, or Rosa damascena, and particularly often is used a cultivar called Kazanlik, which is named after a region in Bulgaria where they do a lot of the perfume production. In addition to that, you'll sometimes see something called white rose oil, which is made from Rosa alba. That's the second rose that's often used in perfume production. The third one is the Rosa centifolia, which is a historic rose that I've covered in my videos before as well. It has a lot of petals, and I think that's the primary one in France. I could be wrong on that. I read a few references on this that said there's a bunch of other perfumed roses that are used for perfume production, but certainly not as high quality as those first three that I mentioned. Now, people use the essential oil, obviously, as a perfume on themselves, where it's reputed to have aphrodisiac properties. Of course, that's what they're going to say. The other thing that people talk about is it having a mood calming effect, something that you can use for stress or anxiety or depression. And, you know, I guess if there's some dopamine release that comes with a nice scent, that makes some sense to me. Once again, for the essential oils, because it is so concentrated, you're not going to be using this except for diluted heavily or externally. It's not something you'd be using internally. Now, if for diluted heavily, you may as well move on to the next topic, which is rose water. Okay, finally, let's talk about rose water. And rose water is not simply a diluted version of the perfume, but sometimes it is a byproduct of the processing of petals for that perfume. It's the water that is a part of that process. Now, people make this homemade by just infusing just about an equal amount of either dried or fresh flowers with hot water and then getting that floral fragrance into the water, the portion of it at least that will dissolve into the water. Now people are using rose water for all sorts of things. They're using it for, and again, once again, the skincare effects, the anti-inflammatory, anti-redness, swelling. Also, people talk about it being, again, a mood improver and good for digestion. So because rose water is in such low concentration that you can use it in everything, it is actually widely used in Middle Eastern cuisine. In fact, I heard an anecdote somewhere that the word for rose in some Middle Eastern languages is actually the flower that produces rose water. So that's kind of an interesting one, but it's used widely in Middle Eastern and Indian cuisine, I've seen as well. And it's, so I'm going to call it safe to use. And once again, all the claims, you know, can cure your headaches, can give you better digestion. All of that comes with the idea of rose water, but again, used externally as cosmetically. It's just as a general skin conditioner and anti-inflammatory, antiseptic. That's what they say about it. All right, that's all I had for you on the herbal uses of roses and which roses you would use it for. I should say about the rose water that I finished with here, if you're asking about which roses you can use, once again, I would just be saying any rose that has a good, strong scent, maybe even the darker colored roses, just like I said for the using of the petals, that would also be good for making the rose water. All right, thanks so much for watching, and if you have any questions, please drop those down in below the video.